into the last of the formal sessions, and this is a very exciting session, I think. Well, the whole day has been exciting, and the whole 2 days have actually been very exciting. But the particular, this is really, through these 2 days, we've been discussing the relation between scholarly research, slow sociology, and the struggle to change the world. The relation to organizations and movements beyond the university. And this is the panel where civil society and movements get to speak back to the scholars and researchers. I just want to say that in putting together this panel, we've put together, I think, a fantastic set of voices and perspectives ranging from those who've been active for a long, long time and have taken their activism through from anti-apartheid struggles through to struggles for democracy in a democracy, through to new voices in civil society, emerging new movements and new kinds of struggles. And we've asked them to reflect on the challenges facing the struggle for change now in their different ways. So I'm going to very, very briefly introduce a panel. I mean, in some ways it's a panel that needs no introductions, as everyone says all the time, but nonetheless I'm going to introduce them. So, first we're going to have Jeff Butlander here, who is probably well known to many of you, is now an advocate, was a founder of the Legal Resources Center in the 1980s, and director of the LRC from 1994 to 96. And then, with the advent of democracy, became Director General in the Department of Land Affairs for 6 years, I think. 4 years. And is now practicing as an advocate on many of the kind of most crucial cases that come to Constitutional Court, and was an evidence leader in the Marikana Commission of Inquiry. Next to him we have Koketso Moeti, who is a young activist who is the director of the, it's the Local Government Action, which is an alliance of organizations mobilizing and informing people around their rights in relation to local government, and mobilizing for the better performance of local government, as well as an activist on something that I don't know what it is and I don't know how it works, because I'm of a much older generation, but it's very similar to what we heard about in the Spanish struggles this morning, and that is a social media organization through which the cell phone becomes a tool of democracy. And then we have Kwesi Mabasa, who don't. We don't have Dinga Sikwebu. He's not well. And John Apollos has very kindly agreed to step in to talk about the United Front. John Apollos is a long-standing activist through a whole series of different struggles, a trade unionist in the 1980s, and then also a key activist in the Anti-Privatization Forum in the 1990s, post the democratic transition, and continued to be a union activist. He tells me now that he's unemployed, but he's involved in the United Front, he's involved in other organizations, so he's got a rich seam of knowledge as an activist to reflect on the new challenges facing the United Front. And then Kwesi Mabasa, who is the social policy coordinator in COSATU. He's got a political science background, but he coordinates various committees, including those dealing with environmental issues and climate issues. He's also been an activist on campus in the University of Pretoria, in the ANC Youth League, in the Anti-Xenophobia Forum, and so on. So we've got a fantastic group of activists and advocates for social change and social justice. And we're going to start off with Jeff. I'm going to give everyone 15 minutes, quite strictly, because I think we really want good participation from the floor as well. Jeff.
Thank you, Carl. Good afternoon. I want to start by winding back about 20 years. 1995, an American sociologist, Rick Abel, published a book entitled Politics by Other Means, Law in the Struggle Against Apartheid, 1980 to 1994. And what Rick Abel wrote about was the use of the law in the struggle against apartheid. For example, in challenging the states of emergency, in supporting the independent trade union movement, in challenging forced removals, and in challenging the pass laws. And what he showed was that where labor and community organizations had used the law skillfully, they were able to protect popular movements, and they were able to have some limits placed on state power. He reflected on what he saw, or what some have called the relative autonomy of the law, and what others have called the double-edged or contradictory function of the law. On the one hand, law places some limits on the exercise of state power and sometimes economic power. But on the other hand, by placing those limits on it, it actually legitimizes that power, that state power and economic power. It creates a system of legitimacy around the law by sometimes, as E.P. Thompson said, seeming to be just. So law has this double-edged quality of restraining and legitimizing power, and this is what Rick Abel referred to that. He then reflected on the fact that one of the reasons why popular movements turned to the courts in apartheid South Africa was that the courts were the only institutions of the state which were accessible to black South Africans and which had some accountability. Even the most right-wing judge sitting in Pretoria had to listen to an argument which was made on behalf of a black activist, had to respond to it in a rational manner, and if the argument was turned down, had to give reasons for doing so, and had to subject those reasons for review and an appeal. Now, no other functionary of the state was subjected to that system of transparent and accountable decision-making, and so the courts became a site of struggle in themselves. That was 1990, up to 1994. Now fast forward to 2015, where are we now? Well, the organs of state are now, of course, subject to many legal controls aimed at creating accountability and public control. We have Parliament and the 9 provincial legislatures are elected on a universal franchise. The parliamentary committees, which is where the real work of Parliament gets done, are now set in public. Ministers and officials are now obliged by law to give reasons for their administrative decisions. Those decisions can readily be challenged in court. Documents held by public bodies are now accessible to the public, and sometimes even documents held by private bodies. And there are a whole host of constitutional institutions aimed at holding power accountable. Public Protector, Human Rights Commission, Auditor General, and so on. And so there's now a political or constitutional structure of accountability and some access to it. And so logically one might expect that the opening up of access to those institutions of state would lead to a reduction in the use of the courts as the means of political engagement. And I think that did by and large happen in the early years after 1994. There was much less challenge and contestation in the courts because civil society groups, for example, which wanted to get their view implemented as to a particular policy or a particular law would go to Parliament, and they were listened to quite respectfully. In fact, even with some fear by the civil servants who knew that they were people who had access to the decision makers, they had some political clout. And when the civil society groups spoke loudly, certainly the senior civil servants and even some of the politicians listened quite closely. And so in the early years, there really was, I think, a shift away from the courts and towards using the more traditional political processes. But particularly in the last 5 or so years, I've been trying to put a time to it, and it's at least 5 years, maybe a little bit longer. Things have changed. We now have the situation where the main parliamentary opposition party litigates all the time in the courts. That's not something we're used to in a parliamentary democracy. Political parties usually engage in politics in Parliament and outside Parliament, but they don't usually litigate. It's not the only party that does so. It's now been followed by UDM, COPE, AGAM, EFF and others Now political parties are taking their their disputes, their disagreements, in some cases, to the courts. And we have court challenges to just about everything. We have challenges to the decision to prosecute or the decision not to prosecute. We have challenges to decisions to hire, decisions to fire, decisions to suspend, decisions not to suspend. We have challenges to acts of parliament which are announced and prepared while the act is still going through parliament. We have challenges to government policies dealing with prosecutions, transport, education, health, immigration, foreign policy matters. We have challenges to toll roads and we have challenges to mining deals. All of this taking place in the courts. Users have a service called Legal Brief, an electronic service which a lot of lawyers subscribe to. You can get it each morning to spoil your day as you wake up. And when it does spoil my day every day, because I read it, I open it up on my laptop and I read of another umpteen challenges being brought to everything, everywhere, in every court. And I'll tell you why I think it's spoilt like that. I'll say something about that in a moment. But it's extraordinary. Day after day, challenge after challenge, it's an avalanche of litigation. Every matter of political dispute seems likely to find its way to the courts. And the public lawyers like me have never been busier. It's a growth industry. So I shouldn't complain. Some of the clients even pay. So why has this happened? Well, and is it a good thing? I think there are two reasons why it's happened. The first reason is that the Constitution, or three reasons why it's happened. The Constitution, four reasons why it's happened. The Constitution, if I go any longer, First is that the Constitution creates a lot of scope for this. Generous rights, broad rights, which have been generously enjoyed, particularly by the Constitutional Court. So the scope, the possibilities are now much greater than they've ever been before, and much greater than they are in most countries with similar constitutions. Secondly, we're only just beginning to learn what are the limits on the powers of the court in this new structure. The courts themselves are trying to figure it out. There's a doctrine of the separation of powers between Parliament and the executive and the court, but no one quite knows what its limits are. The limits we see are limits in quite different democracies, and we don't know how the limits work in what some people call a post-liberal constitutional democracy. And so we're figuring it out as we go along, and the judges themselves are uncertain of where the limits are. And so there's every prospect or a prospect, this uncertainty creates the possibility for innovation on the one hand, and on the other hand for unexpected and even eccentric judgments. You may get what you never imagined was possible. So that's one, the second reason. The third reason is, and the most important reason I think, is that the institutions of political accountability have failed and are failing. We know the elections on a purely proportional representation vote don't create adequate accountability for MPs. Parliament itself seems increasingly inaccessible to people who have a contrarian view, or people who are not insiders. The executive has learnt that if you are closed and unaccountable, and if you don't comply with the rules, that there's little or no sanction attached to that. And so the system has closed down to the outsiders. It's much more difficult to gain access than it was in the mid-1990s. And so we see these political struggles now being fought in the courts. Some Americans, anthropologists, have called it lawfare. Fourthly, I've left out the fourth reason. The fourth reason is that litigation often provides a quick fix. If something has gone wrong, you can get to a court reasonably quickly, you can get a judge to say it's wrong and it's over. That's a very attractive proposition. Who can resist it? So the consequence of all of this is the courts facing an avalanche of litigation. Is it a good thing? I think no, for two reasons. Firstly, I think it's a bad thing because it leads to a depoliticization of what are really political questions. Political struggles are not fought through political processes, they're fought through lawyers and judges. To me, that undermines democracy. And I think we have to find ways of taking back the political space, because that's where many of these decisions really ought to be taken, not by judges. It may sound unusual to have a lawyer saying that, but I do believe that. A very famous radical American lawyer, Gary Bellow, once said that the worst thing a lawyer could do by the government, adopted by the cabinet and enforced by the president, is reversed by the Constitutional Court. And I think that was a moment when a lot of people woke up and said, hang on a second, we can get things through the courts which we hadn't imagined. But one needs to remember what happened in the TAC case. In the TAC case, the litigation was the last part of a campaign which had been run for years. It had been run in the streets through marches, it had been run in Parliament, it had been run in churches, it had been run in the press, it had been run all over. There had been a huge political campaign run that had a huge political momentum, and at the end, the court came and put its imprimatur on what the campaign was doing and said, yes, you're right. That's very different from starting for going to the court first and saying that the court should do it. And so the TAC case, I thought, built social movements, built democracy, and the court was playing an appropriate role at an appropriate time in the process. Too often, I'm afraid, it happens the other way around, and the court is seen as the beginning rather than the end. So, to me, the TAC story, and I don't idealize or romanticize the case. I was involved in the case as one of the lawyers of the TAC. I should declare my interest. But what was absolutely clear in that case was how different it was from so many cases I've been involved in. Firstly, the clients were in control of the case, not the lawyers. The clients knew more than the lawyers. And the clients took control of the case, and they told the lawyers what to do, and the lawyers then had to find the legal arguments to do what the clients were telling them to do. Secondly, as I say, that the legal process came at the end as a culmination of a political campaign rather than as the beginning. So that really brings me back to where I started. In a moment, just say that. So that's the best way I say to use the courts. For in social movements, use lawyers and use the courts skillfully in support of which they do, not engaging in a form of substitutionism in which the lawyers and the judges become the rather ineffective vanguard of change. That finally brings me back to Rick Abel's book. What Abel's book, the other thing that is most interesting in Abel's book is that he shows how the courts were used in 1980 to 1994 in support of popular struggle against apartheid, not as a substitute for popular struggle against apartheid. It was in support of trade unions, in support of political organizations, civic organizations, UDF and so on. It was in support of rural community organizations which were resisting forced removal. The law was brought in as a support to the struggle rather than as a substitute for the struggle. And it seems to me that what we need to do is to find a way of recovering and rebuilding that tradition. Some of that work is already being done by many organizations, and I don't want to say it's not happening. But I do say that if we want our courts to be institutions which support democracy and which enable us to achieve the sort of society we want, it's critical that we see their role as limited, supportive, then not as the primary actors. Their job is to support the process, not to drive it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff, for those very clear arguments and very provocative remarks. I think in a hall where we all tend to want to get involved in strategic litigation all the time. Koketso, you next up.
I want to make it clear that my presentation does not intend to take away anything from the individuals who have indigenized the Left Project and have very powerfully brought in important African feminisms as correctives to the Left Project, because this has repositioned how the hidden Left Project has evolved in this country over the years. My presentation makes the assumption that those who place themselves on the left side of the political spectrum are working towards some form of social justice or positive change, if you will. That they support social equality and often in opposition to social hierarchy and inequality. That they do not practice left politics and claim them for their own sake, but as an attempt to change things for the better. To understand some of the questions and issues I will be raising, it's important to note that what I'm about to say is nothing new. For a very long time, many decades in fact, white leftists have looked to black people for relevance. And this may sound like a scratch records, but the patterns of engagement remain the same. And until Race in the Left project is adequately addressed, what we're going to see is people reenacting what they claim to be opposing. Archie Mafeje has argued that the real reason for the South African Communist Party's two-stage theory was to justify the entry into the African National Congress. The SACP was a white-dominated organization at the time that could not relate to an increasingly right-wing white working class. But it could not recruit in the black working class because the black working class had their own leaders and organizations. Sakela Buhlungu's analysis of the role of white advisors in the union movements in the 1980s also shows this attempt by the white left to have influence in black movements. There have been various moves to block and escape this, reflected in the tensions in the 1920s and the 1930s between the ANC and the SACP. Tensions and splits in the ANC in the 1950s, the Africanist groups that were expelled from the ANC in the 1970s, and of course the formation of the Pan-Africanist Congress. Over time, most of these attempts have had limited impact. I think it's in part because at the time it was not clear what political ideology to adopt in contrast. Politically, it was not clear which theoretical resources black-led movements would draw on at that point in time. But there are also many other examples of white gatekeepers, yet the history is very murky and hardly documented. For instance, there are stories of white leftists in Lesotho and elsewhere working in the 1960s period to ensure that the ANC, rather than the PAC, became the favored vehicle for foreign aid. So now that we have some historical context, I would like to look at what's happening in contemporary South Africa. Many within the left have critiqued NGOs, and this has led to greater support for social movements and CBOs and community struggles rather than NGOs themselves. But how this has played itself out is that the responsibility of being left is handed over to black bodies, sometimes without consent, and leftist practice has been reduced to having the correct analysis of what's going on, scoring points in the echo chambers of the left. These white leftists are actually insulated from some of the radicalness of the left practices they impose on these black bodies. This insulation is not merely about the fact that when blacks are practicing left politics in the informal settlements and the police come, these white leftists are in their walled houses. It's more than that. It's about how they are more generally insulated from the consequences of their arguments. An example of this is how some in the left have supported land invasions, but I have yet to see anybody support a land invasion across the road from their mother's house. I know that there are structural limits to how far a white person can be a leftist, but let's face it, in South Africa these structural limits have not been pushed for the most part. I want to explore how language has also been used as a tool to maintain the dominance of white middle-class leftists. There has been some critique about left movements related to the fact that they are represented in English. The question of language is important in the context of South Africa. We talk about these things, but we never act. I've been to meetings where all blacks speaking the same language, end up speaking English, and that has to do with how English is a language that has been projected as the language of the master. It is the language of employment, and we fall into that trap. So I think it's important for us when we discuss these issues that we constantly remind ourselves of the importance of addressing the language question in South Africa. Lungisile Ntsebeza, who directs the Center of African Studies at UCT, always asks people to express themselves in the language of their choice, and there is no translation. I remember they had a big conference in 2013 and spoke in different languages, and there was no translation. And I think this is how we will learn as South Africans, and this is South Africa. People speak many languages. And if you want to be part of a group showing solidarity with these struggles, learning some of these languages is a good place to start. It's worth noting that while I criticize the choice of our linguistic praxis, it's not just about the use of English. It's also about the adoption of the educated language of the day. Political education has played a key role in the reinscription of the superiority of typically the white left. Some comrades recently were also telling me about this of a new left formation, you know, how it's been playing itself out, and I found that very interesting. I'll talk about that more during the Q&A. Okay, so back to So when we understand the Left Project, it's often unable to relate to sources outside of the English sphere, in the way that Nkoliseng Ntashe's discussion of how aspects of the Pax Ama Africa pop drew its inspiration from the practices of initiation schools. Another issue I find difficult to grapple with is the romanticization of black life and struggles. The actions of some movements are defended by saying they are exercising agency. I struggle with this agency because we operate within a white supremacist heteropatriarchal capitalism. And it is within the superstructure that this agency is supposedly exercised. But choices are never made in a vacuum. They are influenced by the confines imposed by this superstructure. I am by no means saying that if left alone, all black people would suddenly discover their true radicalness and all would be well and rosy. I'm just saying that we have to ask ourselves serious questions about the way things are currently being done. Delaporte and Diani argue that social movements should be non-hierarchical and representative and should have decentralized decision-making structures and increased participation. There's not been enough research aimed at finding out if social movements do in fact operate in this way, and this applies especially here in South Africa. It is often uncritically assumed that there is internal democracy and that the solidarity across race lines works. And suggestions that this is not true have over the years been shot down, with a fairly recent response to Bandile Matlos's political